everyone. I'm Stephen Spatz, Assistant Outreach Librarian. I'd like to welcome you to the final installment of our presidential election lecture series featuring Dr. Matthew Kerbel speaking today. I'd like to say that this has been a great lecture series. We at the Falvey Library are very pleased in how it's turned series. After our main presentation today, we're going to revisit the other installments with a panel discussion of the speakers that spoke earlier in the semester. We have Dr. Laura Brown, who spoke on the Electoral College, Dr. Catherine E. Wilson, who spoke about the nuances of the Hispanic vote, and Dr. David Barrett, who spoke about national security. And now here to introduce our main presentation is Chair of Political Science, Dr. Robert Lindgren.
Thank you. It's great to see such a turnout. I hope you weren't coerced into it. It's very impressive. I hope you all came because you wanted to come. I'll speak very quickly about Matt Kerbel because he's our resident guru on elections. And if you were around this area prior to the election, Matt was on every television station. He was always the one at Villanova that was asked to comment on the election. So he's written 7 books, all right, and one of my favorites is one that has the most catchy title. It's called If It Bleeds, It Leads, An Anatomy of Television News. He has a book also that's going to be coming out in February. It's entitled Netroots, Online Progressives and the Transformation of American Politics. And what it does is it looks at the way the internet is changing the way campaigns are conducted, the relationship between citizens and politicians, and the way people feel about politics. So what he's here for today is to talk about what happened when we went to the polls back on November 4th. And then, as was mentioned, once he finishes his talk, the 3 previous speakers will then join Matt in a panel discussion and then open it up to questions and answers. So, Matt, all yours.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, everybody. Is this working? It doesn't seem like... Are we all right?
I think so.
You can hear me back there. Great. So 3 things to cover today. First, what happened? Second, why did it happen? Third, what does it mean? So let's start out with what happened on November 4th when we went to the polls. Well, the first thing that happened is the public opinion polls, by and large, were correct. There was a lot of data about this election, about what might happen, and a lot of questions about whether or not those data were correct. And it turned out that, by and large, they were. If you looked at the final polling averages right before November 4th, it looked like Obama was going to win with a margin of roughly 6 to 8 points, and that's exactly what happened. They're actually still counting votes, so we don't really know what the final numbers are. But it looks like it's going to be somewhere in the 6-point range, something like that, maybe 7, somewhere in that range by the time all the votes are counted. So the polls were right. There were a number of questions about what might happen that could have made the polls wrong, and it turned out that none of those things came to pass. Would young people turn out? It turned out that they did. Would new voters turn out? Turned out that they did. Roughly 7 million new people went to the polls this year, and of those, roughly 5 million were young voters under the age of 30. So Obama was able to get out his vote. Would white voters tell pollsters that they were going to vote for Obama, then secretly go into the voting booth and not? That's what we call the Bradley effect. Well, it turns out that did not happen. Well, turned out not so much. That really wasn't a problem in estimating the final results. Would Hillary Clinton voters move to John McCain in large numbers? It turns out that they didn't. Roughly 85% of people who voted for Hillary Clinton in the primary voted for Obama in the general election. That's a pretty good number when you consider that Obama carried 89% of all Democrats, McCain 89% of all Republicans. It's about what you'd expect for a candidate to, how well you'd expect them to do with their own partisans. So that wasn't an issue. Could Obama carry states like Ohio and Pennsylvania? One of the claims that Hillary Clinton made during the primary was that he could not because there would be too many white working-class voters who would not vote for him. It turned out that he was able to carry both states. He carried Ohio by 4 points. He carried Pennsylvania by better than 10 points. In both cases, a far better showing than either Kerry or Gore in the last couple of cycles. In fact, if you look at the map, if you look at the electoral map this year, it looks different from the electoral map that we were used to seeing. Between 2000 and 2004, we had what we like to call the blue states and the red states. And in fact, only 3 states changed sides between those 2 cycles. So the map was virtually identical each time. You had Kerry winning in the Northeast, in parts of the Midwest, and on the West Coast, and Gore the same. And then you had Bush winning pretty much everywhere else. This time around, we saw a different result. In fact, if you look at Obama's numbers, both in terms of who voted for him and where they live, what we really see is a fairly geographic and demographic victory that looks different from what we've seen in recent elections, and I think significantly different from the way other Democrats have won in the past. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. If you look geographically at the map, Obama won by carrying all the states that both Kerry and Gore won. He, in addition to that, carried the 3 states that either Kerry or Gore won: New Hampshire, New Mexico, and Iowa. Those are the states that changed sides between 2000 and 2004. And then he won both hotly contested large swing states, Ohio and Florida, and several red states: Virginia, North Carolina, Indiana, Colorado, Nevada. Came within 4 points of winning Montana, within 8 points of winning North Dakota. So it was a geographic win that changed the map. It looks completely different than the previous maps we've seen. He also won 1 electoral vote in Nebraska, but I didn't want to go into that. Nebraska is one of 2 states that divides its electoral votes by congressional district. So he actually picked up 1 vote in Nebraska for a total of 365 electoral votes. Now, if you look at it demographically, and you look at where he won, not only did young people turn out, but they voted in overwhelming numbers for Obama, 2 to 1. Much larger numbers than what we saw for Kerry. If you look at Latinos, the largest growing demographic in the country, same thing. Obama wins by 2 to 1. African American voters, almost unanimous. Among single women, did very, very well. He won in the suburbs. So if you look at the various demographic groups that are used to putting together, where did McCain do well? Well, his vote tended to be older, and it tended to be clustered along the Appalachian chain. In fact, if you want to get a sense of McCain's vote, get a topographic map and take a look at the Appalachian chain, and then go from the northeast to the southwest, over the Appalachian Mountains, west into Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and then up through the Great Plains. That's where McCain did well. That's where he increased, with the exception of the Great Plains, he increased his share of the vote over Bush in 2004. But it is a smaller coalition, and it is an older coalition. It's a less diverse coalition. And in that, you have some warning signs for the Republican Party as we move forward. Because, as a result of this election, I think it's not unreasonable to say that the Republican Party right now finds itself a regional party, leaderless and out of power, in need of a way to come back. More important is the fact that this is the first time since before the New Deal that a president has been elected with a governing coalition that does not include the South. The South remains solidly Republican with a couple of important exceptions. What we would call the New South, or the emerging South, the states of Virginia, North Carolina, Florida. The Old South remains solidly Republican. But in the past, Republicans were able to have a base in the South and expand beyond that base and put together a governing majority. This time around, they lost the rest. Well, how did that happen? Why did that happen? We'll get to that in a second. I also want to emphasize, before we go there, a little bit about what happened to the congressional races. Because the magnitude of the Democrats' win is also reflected in what happened in Congress. On the House side, a pickup of about 20 seats. There are still a few left to be called. On the Senate side, pickup of at least 7 Senate seats, with still 2 left to be called. There's a recount going on right now in Minnesota, where there were 3 million votes cast, and 200 votes separate the Republican incumbent Norm Coleman from his Democratic challenger. That's going to be probably a couple of weeks before it's decided. In the state of Georgia, there is a special election that's going to be held first week of December, because by Georgia state law, you need 50% plus 1, a clear majority, in order to win a federal election. And in this case, Saxby Chambliss, the incumbent Republican, got 49.8% of the vote. So they have to hold a runoff, basically. And so those 2 seats are still open. But what we do know right now is that Democrats picked up 3 open seats that were Republican seats in Virginia, Colorado, New Mexico. They took over 4 seats that were held by Republican incumbents in North Carolina, New Hampshire, Oregon, and Alaska. And again, 2 other Republican incumbents still out, we don't know yet. But what I think is even more interesting than that is they didn't lose any seats. And in the House, they only lost a handful of seats. And then if you look at what happened in 2006, Democrats didn't lose any seats in the Senate there either, or on the House side. In other words, what happened on November 4th, in many respects, was a continuation of what happened in 2006. We had what we call a wave election in 2006, and then a second consecutive wave election in 2008. And that's noteworthy because of how unusual it is. When we call it a wave election, what we mean is it's not really an anti-incumbent year. It's more that the electorate is taking out its anger, really, on one particular party. And that's what we saw in 2006, where there was a wave election, and it ended up in the Democrats taking back the House, taking back the Senate barely, and doing it without losing any incumbents. And then in 2008, a second wave formed, or it was a continuation of the first wave, but for the second consecutive race, it was an anti-Republican year, and again, Democrats in this case were able to build on their majorities in Congress and elect a president. So if you put these 2 cycles together, Democrats have picked up 50 seats in the House, they've picked up 13 at least in the Senate, and they won the White House with a sweeping majority. The last time we had 2 consecutive wave elections that resulted in the out party taking over first Congress and then the presidency was 1930 and 1932, when Franklin Roosevelt became president. So is there something in that we can learn about what's going on now? Is there something that we can understand from history, that we can learn from history to help figure out what happened this month? And I think maybe there is. But I don't want to go back to 1932, not yet. I do, however, want to go back to 2000, because I think that the best way to understand why we had this wave, this double wave, is to look at what happened since the 2000 election, which we all know, either from having experienced it or from having read about it, was the election that went into overtime. And it was decided 7 weeks later by a ruling of the Supreme Court that ended the recount vote in Florida. It was as close to a tie as any national election ever could be. And I guess you could make the case that under those circumstances, it probably called for the winner to be fairly modest in the way he governed, and possibly even to invite in the other side in a kind of national unity effort. But George Bush chose a different route, and he was able to do it because of the demographic distribution of the country at the time. What he looked at when he looked at the demographics, he saw that there were more conservatives than liberals. There are still more today. Still, that hasn't changed. There are still more self-identified conservatives than liberals. But when you looked at party identification, and you looked at who identified as a Republican, who identified as a Democrat, they were pretty close. They were pretty close, but Bush recognized that if he was able to really get his base motivated and excited, and then take about half of those independents in the middle who always determine the outcome, take about half of them with him, he could govern for his base primarily and still win re-election. In fact, that's the strategy he used in 2004, and it worked very well. It started falling apart after 2004, and Bush didn't make any adjustments because he really couldn't. He was left with his base because he had basically decided that was going to be his strategy. So what happened after 2004? Well, a couple of things happened. If we track the trajectory of public opinion over the period of time from 2004 to 2008, we start out immediately after 2004, and we find that the middle of the electorate, those independents, are still pretty nicely divided between the two parties. But then we notice something interesting after the Terry Schiavo case, which some of you may remember, I don't know, but that was an instance where Congress decided to pass legislation that dealt specifically with one individual who was on life support. The president signed that legislation, came back from Texas to do it. And what happened after that was the middle part of the electorate looked at that and said, huh? Wait a minute. That's not what we voted for. Then came Hurricane Katrina and the response to Katrina. And that's when the middle of the electorate starts to really move away from George Bush. And then, of course, we see an emerging consensus on the war. There was still at this point, in 2005, 2006, no consensus on how to end the war. There was no consensus on. At this point, we now start to see independents tracking very closely with Democrats. Some pollsters started calling them Indycrats. They were still independents, but in terms of their preferences, in terms of their attitudes, and in terms of their political preferences, they looked a lot more like Democrats than Republicans, and that set up the 2006 wave. After the wave broke, what you'd normally expect is for the party that loses the election to change course. And in fact, if we go back to the previous wave election, which was in 1994, that's exactly what happened. Just very quickly, in 92, Bill Clinton is elected. A number of things happen that lead the middle of the electorate to believe that he's not governing the way he campaigned. He advocates for gays in the military. He advocates for a health care program that never quite took hold. People in the middle of the electorate felt that he was governing in a way that was simply more liberal than what he had claimed to be when he campaigned as a New Democrat. And in that case, the wave broke against the Democrats, and they lost control of Congress in 1994. What did Clinton do? Clinton looked at the situation. He said, well, you know, I've got to change my behavior. I'm on the ballot in 2 years. And if I don't do something now, I'm off. I'm out of here. So I better make sure I do. And so what he ended up doing was adopting a new strategy called triangulation, where he began to adopt issue positions that were acceptable to the conservative majority in Congress. And you know, he would tweak them a little bit, things like welfare reform, for instance. He would tweak them a little bit to try to put a little bit of his imprint on it, and then take credit for it when it passed. And by doing that, he won re-election successfully in 1996, and it was a way of responding to the 94 elections. So, what happened in 96? Clinton's re-elected. Some of the Republicans who had been elected in the big wave of 94 carry a little bit of that shoreline with it. And it makes sense that some of the people elected in the wave election are going to be people who are going to represent districts that they're just not, they don't fit them very well. Republicans who represent districts, that's still a more of a Democratic tilt. In a normal year, they don't win elections. So that's what we saw happen in 94. What's interesting is that did not happen this time around. That did not happen this year because Bush did not change course. He didn't do anything to change course. So the anger that the electorate expressed in 06 continued to build. If we look at some of the indicators of that anger, when people are asked about the direction of the country, do you believe the direction of the country is right or wrong? Supermajorities, upwards of 70, 75, 80, I saw polls that had it at 85%, said wrong direction. It's very tough to be the incumbent party in a year like that. And it was because this anger, this sense that the country is off course, that this anger had been allowed to build for so long, that we had this second consecutive wave. If you look at Bush's disapproval ratings, his disapproval ratings topped out at 70%. That's a record. That's really unbelievable. It's hard to get 70% of a group to agree on anything. So that really was an unbelievable number. And it was the backdrop for the second wave. So now we've had this second wave. What does it mean? Well, I'll give you my take. I think it represents an opportunity for Obama and the Democratic Party. And I think it represents a warning, should be a big warning light for the Republican Party. Where are we going to go? What's going to happen next? Obama won election. For whatever reasons people voted for him. In a wave election, people are always voting against the other folks. And it's important to remember that. Obama needs to govern. And he needs to govern effectively, and he needs to govern with some competence. My sense is that the American public is willing to give him a shot. My sense is, and I say that because, again, there's data on this, about 50% of Republicans have said they want him to succeed. That's the initial sentiment. There should be a honeymoon. Now, of course, there were an awful lot of problems to tackle. The joke going around Washington right before the election was that whoever wins this is going to ask for a recount. And, you know, I can see why, because of what they have to tackle. So in some respects, expectations are very high, but at the same time, the public at least initially wants Obama to succeed. If Obama succeeds, he has an opportunity. And that opportunity would be to lock in the gains that he and his party have put together over the past 2 election cycles. And I think in order to understand this and where we are, I want to do one more historic analogy, if I could. And that deals with sort of a broader sweep of what we would call political regimes. Because we can think of American history, if you want, as being more or less dominated at different points by different political regimes, supported by different electoral coalitions that have been more or less stable for a period of time, but that ebb and flow and that eventually die out. So we can speak of the New Deal regime that came out of the last 2 consecutive wave elections of 1930 and 1932, surviving through the 1940s and 50s into the 1960s. During that period of time, Democrats easily won the White House, with the exception of Dwight Eisenhower, who was the only Republican to serve during that period of time. And instructively, Eisenhower, during his 8 years, did not try to undo the New Deal. In fact, he actually ratified the New Deal. So we could see that this was predominantly a period of center-left government that started to fall apart for a number of reasons in the 1960s, partly when Lyndon Johnson moved away from the original tenet of the New Deal to try to use the government to address equality of outcome as opposed to equality of opportunity, certainly with the civil rights movement and the way that affected the southern part of the New Deal coalition, the Vietnam War. There were any number of reasons why the New Deal coalition began to fall apart. In 1968, Richard Nixon's elected to the presidency in a narrow election that began a period of divided government, but largely right-of-center government. It took a while for Richard Nixon to give way to Ronald Reagan in 1980, which I think was really the pinnacle of this period of time, this regime, and it continued through the first George Bush, second George Bush. The only Democrats to hold office during this period of time were Jimmy Carter, who only served 1 term, only won by 1 point, and came from the conservative wing of his party. And Bill Clinton, we already talked about how he tried to govern as a liberal, and he couldn't do it during this period of time. Very similar to the way Eisenhower was a minority president during the New Deal regime. Under George Bush, this regime began to fall apart in a hurry. And when Bush lost the middle, he was left only, really, with a very loyal, very dedicated, but shrinking base. Over the last 2 years, Democrats have registered millions of new voters, and they turned out. Republicans have been losing voters. Unaligned or independent voters have grown in number, many of them disaffected Republicans. That's a very bad sign for a political party when you start hemorrhaging support like that. And that's what we started to see over the course of the last couple of years. It's an indication of the decline of a regime. In fact, when a regime begins to lose its intellectual energy, it's reduced to the sum total of its affiliated interests. That happened to the Democrats in the 1970s and the 1980s. and into the 1990s, when they were unable to offer a message of why people should vote for them that resonated with the broader public. And there are signs from this election that the Republicans are now at that stage in their regime cycle. One of the most animated components of the Republican coalition is social conservatives. One of the biggest problems that John McCain faced was how to make social conservatives content and still appeal to the middle. He was unable to do it. The hope was that the choice of Sarah Palin as a running mate might have crossover appeal. But Sarah Palin came to be portrayed both by the campaign, for her own words, and in press coverage as somebody who was right of center, who animated the base, but who did not appeal to the middle. Very polarizing figure. Again, polling data. If you look at the polling data on Sarah Palin, she does very, very well with Republicans, and she does very badly with everybody else. Over the course of the campaign, she and, by extension, John McCain, had to defend her position on the ticket. They had to defend her ability to step in as president. And they weren't able to win the argument. But what's more telling, I think, is that they had to make the argument. What would have happened if John McCain, let's say he wants to run with a woman, and let's say part of that is in an attempt to appeal to disaffected Hillary Clinton voters? It's not a bad strategy. What if he had run with Olympia Snowe? Nobody would have questioned her qualifications, senator from Maine. But she is socially progressive. He would have lost his base. Or what if he had run with Joe Lieberman, which apparently he wanted to do? Now, I'm not so sure Joe Lieberman has a lot of crossover appeal, and I don't think he handled himself particularly well when he was Gore's running mate, but let's just say he wanted to run with Joe Lieberman. I think if he had done it, he was comfortable with Lieberman, they're personal friends, I think if he had done it, then McCain and Lieberman would have been the only people in the building at the convention. You know, everybody would have left. It would have been an empty room. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the Republicans have a problem in that this is a core constituency. This is a core constituency that wants to be heard and expects to be heard inside the party.
If Kelly Kirkpatrick is still in the library, would you please stop by the circulation desk? Kelly Kirkpatrick, please come to the circulation desk. Thank you.
But it's not a constituency that is going to have crossover appeal beyond the base. This is very similar to what happened to Democrats as the New Deal coalition fell apart. So, what's the challenge then for Republicans? Well, the challenge is to get it right, to figure out why they lost this election, and then to do something about it. That's generally difficult to do. You know, every party coalition is a hodgepodge. It always is. We have these big, broad umbrella parties in this country. They're huge. And they bring together different constituencies that would not always naturally want to sit down together. But that's what we've got. When you're in power, that really papers over an awful lot of differences. When you lose, well, those differences tend to emerge. And when you've just taken a drubbing, a lot of people point fingers, and we've started to see a lot of the finger pointing. So what Republicans need to do right now is figure out why they lost and figure out what they need to do about it. It's not an easy thing to do because if you look at the data, a good argument can be made for the reason they lost being they were unable to reach out to the middle where elections are won and lost. And that to the extent that the social conservative base is concentrated in the South, where they currently have their greatest electoral strength, it's very difficult, unless you can put the South together with other parts of the country, it's very difficult to, by that particular factor this time around. So it does give him an opportunity, but Democrats realized for the past couple of cycles. That's his challenge. In part, Republicans by necessity will react to that. In part, they will react to that. But I think it's likely that when they do come back, as they do reemerge, that they're going to need to reemerge in a different fashion and in a different political time than what we saw in the past. In other words, I would expect the next successful Republican presidential candidate to look different from Nixon, Reagan, Bush, or Bush. I think that the indications are we are moving into a transitional period where the governing coalitions will begin to look different. You know, in 1970, which didn't really look at the time, following the 1968 election, it didn't really look at the time like a transformational moment. Sometimes you need history to help you look back and figure out what really happened. And certainly we're obviously very close to what just happened in 2008. So it remains to be seen. But in 1970, Richard Nixon's Attorney General, John Mitchell, said, "This country is going to go so far to the right, you won't recognize it." Now that was 10 years before Ronald Reagan. It was 24 years before Newt Gingrich. These things can play out over a long period of time. But I think that the primary lesson of the 2008 cycle is the pendulum has reached one side and it may now be swinging back. Okay, thank you. Now here to disagree with everything I just said is our panel of experts.
Sure. I guess we should start with this.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kerbal. I really enjoyed that conversation. We should start with this.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kerbal. I really enjoyed that conversation. I guess there are a couple things I wanted to do. The first thing that I wanted to do is because I was the very first speaker on September 17th in this series. I think a lot of people, one of the things that I did say was that I actually predicted McCain to win. And I know that sounds like ridiculous and wild, but one of the things that I did do, but of course I only made 20 copies of these, so you guys are going to have to share. But I've charted for you something that I think is very interesting, and it basically charts the Dow Jones Industrial Average on a weekly close alongside the approval rating for both Barack Obama and Senator John McCain, and how those things are related. I was just at the Northeast up at SUNY Buffalo, and he said something which I think bears out in the data, and I think it's actually sort of my perspective on this, which is essentially it's not so surprising that Senator Barack Obama won. The bigger surprise is that prior to the Wall Street meltdown, that John McCain was even in the game, given the structural characteristics of this election already. So let me pass out a few of these so you can take a look at what I'm describing. Let me just get some of those. You guys want to show them? Sure. You guys, here's you guys. Okay, that's fine. So, for those of you, if you look on the second page, you'll see the chart. And one of the things that's really fascinating about this chart from my perspective is if you stick your hand from September 19th on, and you stick your hand over that section of the chart, what you see is that actually prior to September 19th, it was a very competitive race. And so I guess I do tend to see this election as much more, as the title suggests, a reaction, perhaps, rather than a realignment. What makes me say that? Well, a couple things. Probably the largest thing is that when you look at the exit poll data from 2008 and 2004 and 2000, which is listed on the front page of this, one of the things that you see is that the electorate itself in 2008 was made up of 39% Democrats, 29% independents, and 32% Republicans. So in other words, there were 7% more Democrats in the electorate than Republicans. Well, is it any surprise then that the Democratic nominee, Senator Barack Obama, won by about 7 percentage points of the vote? In other words, Democrats voted for their nominee. And while that may seem like, well, gee, if there were 7% more Democrats in the electorate, then doesn't that mean that the electorate has become overwhelmingly more Democratic? Well, if you look in 2000, the exit polls actually showed that the electorate was at that point in time 39% Democratic as well. In other words, I think when you look at what's happened over the last 3 elections, is we've actually seen the pendulum swing one way to the Republicans. Now it's just swung the other way to the Democrats. I am a lot less believing, or I should say perhaps I'm more skeptical, that there's any sort of long-term trend in what we are seeing. I tend to think we are still essentially a 50-50 nation, and what's happening is that these moderates who do move, and as Dr. Kerbel explained, they do make up sort of who wins in an election. I think that this time around, they sided with the Democrats largely for economic reasons. And this table that I actually showed you, in fact, if you look at the data on a daily basis, there is even a greater correlation between Senator John McCain's approval rating and the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It is actually quite striking, and I think that is suggestive more of how the election ended up turning out than where it started. There's also some just sort of other data points that I put on here, which I think are important. Again, if you look over the course of these 3 elections, 2000, 2004, and 2008, there has not been a large increase in the number of liberals. So from an ideological perspective, things are not changing all that much. Yet, in fact, there has been an increase in the number of conservatives. In 2000, only 29% of the electorate considered themselves conservative. In 2008, 34% of the electorate did, the same number as in 2004. So I think that whether or not we're actually going to see sort of a long-term realignment, again, I completely agree with Dr. Kerbel that it's way too early to know these things. We have to see at least 3 or 4 or 5 elections. But is it unusual to have 2 waves in a row? Yes, but in some ways that's also somewhat more indicative of this time that we're in. Both 2002 and 2004 were waves for the Republicans. And if you look at the number of contested Senate seats in both of those elections, they actually swung overwhelmingly to the Republicans in both 2002 and 2004. So now in 2006 and 2008, there was a correction back. Also, Rasmussen reports, which does a lot of polling, and in fact, they were one of the most accurate pollsters this time around, had a couple polls that they put out in the last few months, which I thought were really interesting. Currently, 59% of registered voters agree with Ronald Reagan's statement that, quote, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. Now, if we've become sort of an overwhelmingly more progressive, liberal country, then that statement really wouldn't hold. So it's surprising to me that you see 59% actually see that. In addition, they did this right after the election, and I thought this was very fascinating. They found that among all voters, 50% say that it is at least somewhat likely that a Republican will follow Obama. And by that they meant in 2012. So if half the electorate, a week or so after Senator Obama is getting elected believes that there could be a switch to the Republican Party again, that suggests to me that people are, shall we say, much more cavalier about their partisan affiliations than they ever have been in the past. And this goes with essentially an argument that I believe is what's been going on in our electorate for a while now. Dr. Kerbel talked about sort of these regime changes and the like. One of the things that he didn't mention is that much of the scholarship found that in the 70s and 80s there was what people called de-alignment. It appeared as though many, many people were no longer affiliating strongly with a political party. That did change around, and now more people do see themselves committed to a political party since basically the late 1990s and on through this decade. But I think one of the things that's interesting is I'm not so sure how loyal those people are to that party as a result of that period. So do I think that there will be long-term Democratic growth? There may be, especially some constituencies, certainly young people, certainly Hispanics, and whether or not women stay in this position is going to be an interesting one. They were a big part of George W. Bush's win in 2004 as well. So when I look at this election, I think I'm just still waiting. I'm waiting to see what are going to be the outcome from a number of future elections. And I'm not so sure that I see that sort of the lessons are necessarily as clear-cut as Dr. Kerbel does.
Thank you. I'd like to limit my remarks to what happened to religious voters and Latino voters in this election. That was the topic of my talk for the election series. And first and foremost, I think it's very clear that the Obama campaign played a very good ground game with religious voters. And we see this particularly among minority voters, non-white religious voters. Obama participated in 2 religion forums. One was the Compassion Forum at Messiah College, where he was asked questions as specific as whether God intervened in history. The Faith Forum at the Saddleback Church, which was moderated by Reverend Rick Warren. And he also presented a speech on support for the faith-based initiative, actually calling for their expansion in a certain regard. The head of the Knights of Columbus recently commented that Obama won religious voters because he positioned himself as the more religious candidate. He relied on faith outreach coordinators, which helped him recast the Democratic Party as more faith-friendly. And one could even argue that the literature he used during the primary season had tinges of cultural conservatism. One example is a brochure that was circulated in some communities entitled Called to Christ, which read, "Kneeling beneath that cross on the south side, I felt I heard God's Spirit beckoning me. I submitted myself to His will and dedicated myself to discovering His truth and carrying out His works." So what happened to religious voters? Well, first and foremost, Obama wins the Catholic vote overall by a 9-point margin, 54 to 45. But this is in large case due to Latino Catholics, because if we look at the white Catholic vote, that is 52 to 47 for McCain. But even here, Obama still gets a 4-point increase from Kerry's 43% of the white Catholic vote. So I think it's clear to say that he makes significant inroads, but more so with non-white religious voters. Obama also makes inroads among Protestant voters. 65%, however, of white Protestants voted for McCain. Obama gets a 2-point jump from 2004, where Kerry got 32% of the white Protestant vote. Obama gets 34%. But what's most interesting is how Obama captures 26% of the evangelical vote, which is up 5 percentage points from 2004. Still, again, the inroads are much more prominent when you factor in the non-white Protestants. Overall, McCain wins the Protestant vote, but by 54 to 45, as opposed to 65-34 when you're looking at white Protestant voters. So what does this tell us? It tells us that non-white religious voters are responsible for these inroads. Latino Protestants voted very heavily for Obama, 67% for Obama in 2008 versus 54% for Bush in 2004. We actually are seeing a rise of the religious left, moderate evangelicals and cultural Catholics. And we also see a narrowing of the gap between those who attend services weekly or more. This group goes into the grouping for Republicans, but as you can see, McCain in this grouping of those who attend services weekly or more receives 55% of the vote to Obama's 43%, versus Bush's 61% to Kerry's 39% in 2004. He also receives a higher percentage of those who attend services more than weekly and gets an 8-point jump from Kerry's 39% in 2004. So that's on the religious voter side. So what happens to Latino voters? As predicted, and I think Dr. Kerbel is correct in this regard with respect to the public opinion polls, they were dead on with regard to Latino voters. As predicted, they vote for Obama 2-to-1, 67 to 31%. And this is considered a remarkable turnaround because remember, in the primaries, they vote 2-to-1 Hillary Clinton over Barack Obama. The Latino vote, therefore, I think we can say, hovers between the white vote. 43% of white voters voted for Obama, 95% of black voters vote for Obama. So the Latino vote hovers between the white and the black vote at 67%. Latino youth vote for Obama in very, very high numbers, 76% to 19%. We also see a number of states where the Latino vote registers over 70% in favor of Obama. The largest percentage of Latinos voting for Obama is actually New Jersey. 78% of Latino New Jerseyans vote for Obama, 76% of Nevadans, Latino Nevadans, 74% of Latinos in California, and 72% of Latinos in Illinois. If we look at the key battleground states, Colorado, Nevada, and New Mexico, we also see here an increase in the share of voters who are Latino. So between the 2004 and 2008 election, in Colorado, there's a 5% increase in Latino voters, which gives us about 132,000 new voters. Obama wins that state by fewer than 200,000 votes. In Nevada, 5% increase in Latino voters, meaning 72,000 new Latino voters. Obama wins the state by 120,000 voters. And a 9% increase in Latino voters in New Mexico, Obama, which means 92,000 new voters. Obama wins the state by 120,000 voters, okay? So there is a correlation, I would argue, between this increase of new Latino voters and Obama winning the state. We see, therefore, a surge in minority voting. The number of Latinos going to the polls increased by 25% from 2004. This is due to naturalized citizens and first-time voters. 0.3 million votes cast. So I want to end just by sort of looking forward how this will affect the Republican and Democratic parties. It's going to be very brief. With respect to the Republican Party, I think Dr. Kerbel is dead on here. There needs to be some rethinking about how to engage certain demographic groups, and I think this is particularly the case with Latino voters. There was a recent article written called Hispanic Panic, talking about the way in which the Republican Party really needs to get its act together and try to think about how to appropriately court the Latino vote. I think this is especially the case in places like Florida, where Obama wins the Latino vote 57 to 42%. In 2004, Bush wins that vote 56 to 44%. So something seriously is going on here. I think we can say that the majority of Latino voters in Florida are now non-Cuban, which actually ties into this dynamic. They are Puerto Rican, Dominican, Mexican, Nicaraguan, Colombian, Venezuelan, Argentine. But that's telling us something, that the Republican Party cannot just rely on the Cuban voters anymore, particularly in Florida. In Arizona, Obama wins Latinos 56 to 41. This is in McCain's home state. In Texas, Obama wins Latinos 63 to 35%. So what explains this? In my talk, I discussed immigration reform and the failure of comprehensive immigration reform. But interestingly enough, much like the rest of the electorate, when Latinos were polled why they cast their vote, 6 out of 10 said the economy, right? So where does this leave Republicans? Some say in very bad shape. Others, like Bill Richardson, argue that the Latino vote came back to the Democratic Party after a brief flirtation with the Republicans. And if you think about strategist for the Republican Party, one noteworthy strategist, Lionel Sosa, who was a outreach coordinator for Latinos for Reagan, for both Bushes, and for McCain. His argument that is that his strategy was never really about getting Latinos to think of themselves as a Republican. His argument was, quote, my approach as always has always been to have Latinos stay Democrat, but just vote for the best man, okay? What does this tell us about Democrats? Again, as Dr. Kerbel and Dr. Brown mentioned, there's very high expectations for Obama in this new administration, and particularly among Latinos to deliver on immigration reform. The problem with this is that what's going to happen with these promises and with the prospect of immigration reform, especially in an economic downturn, and as we were beginning to see higher rates of unemployment. Last year, Rahm Emanuel, who's now Obama's chief of staff, the incoming chief of staff, remarked that any immigration bill could not pass a first 4-year term of a Democratic presidency. Why is this the case? Democrats are not worried about antagonizing nativists or those who want to keep immigrants out of the country, but they're more concerned with antagonizing organized labor. And I think this is particularly the case in the economy that we're seeing currently and ahead of us. So my prediction is that immigration reform will be off the agenda for at least the next 2 years, if not for the entire 4-year term, but that Obama will take intermediate steps, halting immigrant raids, supporting in-state tuition for undocumented students, and I think we're going to see Latino representation as senior advisors or in the cabinet, folks like Bill Richardson, the governor of New Mexico, and Antonio Villaraigosa, the mayor of Los Angeles. And finally, I would argue we may in fact see the nomination of the first Latino justice in the Supreme Court. So I'll pass it along.
But just about the economy, one question in my mind, that's not a real prediction, but one real question in my mind is how patient will the American public be with President Obama when the economy does not get better soon? I actually did hear one prominent economist say that he thinks the economy will start getting better by the end of 2009. And I hope he's right, because my TIA-CREF retirement account is really a mess. But, honestly, I don't think he's right. I think we are I don't want to say the early stages, but we are not in the late stage of a recession. I think we're in a recession that's going to get a good deal worse before it gets better. And so a question on my mind is, at what point will the public, if ever, start blaming a President Obama for these economic conditions? I wouldn't think that that would happen in the congressional elections 2 years from now, but I wonder about, I think his chances for re-election will depend quite a bit on the economic conditions, but also on his skill. I remember that when Jimmy Carter was elected, I was a few years out of college, very interested in politics and the presidency. And I remember having these hopes, which now seem quite naive. I had these hopes that Carter was going to be another FDR in the sense of political skill. Something told me that Carter was going to be this really, really politically skillful president. And then in the first year or so, I was dismayed by how Carter, although a good man, seemed to be, he really is working hard and doing the best he can with very difficult economic situations. The public believes, somewhat naively, that presidents have quite a bit of control over what happens with the economy. I think the reality is that presidents have rather limited control, so we'll see how that plays out. But my talk a month or so ago was about national security. I had a prediction that turned out to be true, but hey, it was a pretty easy call. My prediction was that national security issues were not going to play a big role in this election, and you know, they didn't. It was very much, I think, about the economy and about a good deal of animosity toward and disapproval of President Bush. So that was not a hard appointments. And is that a good idea? There's a lot of talk about, well, will he appoint Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, a person who voted for the authorization of the war in Iraq? Will he keep on either of the two key leaders of the intelligence establishment, the current CIA director and the current director of national intelligence? I don't know. If you thought I could sort of give you the inside scoop, I wish I could, but I can't. I think any of those are possibilities, especially the Clinton and the Gates possibilities. I think Hillary Clinton could be a very good Secretary of State. Gates is, I think, in some ways trickier because he has helped make policy in the Bush administration, and so for him to now make policy and be a policy advisor to a president who, in a prior political life, voted against the war in Iraq, for example, there's something tricky there. But I will say that I've tried to read some of the speeches in the last year or so that Secretary of Defense Gates has given, and I see some nuances there where Gates was trying to separate himself, not in an overt way, but to show there was some difference of emphases between him and President Bush, and certainly between him, Secretary of Defense Gates, and Vice President Cheney. So that might work out well. Interestingly to me, I think it would be easier for a President Obama to keep on the two intelligence leaders. If you're the director of the CIA, if you are the director of national intelligence, President Obama will keep these two in practice, sort of change the leaders of the intelligence agencies, not always, but frequently when a new president comes in. So I think that would be a bit unfortunate, though I read that that's likely. So that's the first point I wanted to make. And then I wanted to talk about sort of the political talk regarding national security, and then what the intelligence estimates are saying. And I want to remind, some of you may have been here for my talk, but many of you I'm sure were not. There are two national intelligence estimates that have been produced in the last year or so. A national intelligence estimate, NIE, is the most authoritative statement that our intelligence establishment can produce. It is contributed to by the various intelligence agencies and then presided over by the leaders. And we all know that sometimes these NIEs get it wrong. There was an infamous NIE before the war in Iraq, which did, you might say, exaggerate the likelihood of Saddam having weapons of mass destruction. But the batting average in the longer run of U.S. intelligence history for NIEs is actually pretty good. So there was an NIE a year or so ago which made the case that Iran is not as problematic as everyone seems to be saying, in the sense that there's substantial evidence of Iran stopping or at least slowing down major aspects of any program relating to the production of nuclear weapons. The Bush White House clearly did not like that national intelligence estimate, but what strikes me is today there's all this discussion about the possibility or maybe the need to go to war against Iran, when again, according to U.S. intelligence, we're not at that stage yet. But again, the intelligence tell a president what policy choice to make. But what they are saying is Iran has slowed things down in terms of this nuclear stuff. But there's not much talk about that in the political discussion in this country. So in a sense, that Iran NIE was sort of good news, but it tends to be ignored. There's another NIE regarding Al-Qaeda, which I would say is bad news. It was produced about a year ago. It was sort of rewritten and revised a bit some months ago. What it says about Al-Qaeda is that, yes, in some parts of the world, like, well, Iraq, for example, there are places in the world where Al-Qaeda is doing badly. But according to this NIE, Al-Qaeda has increased its ability in recent years to strike us here at home. Now, again, that didn't seem to be a big issue in the election campaign, and if it had been, well, I suppose that might have helped McCain, but in any case, it was not a big issue. But the election is over. It will be of interest to me to see how much attention a President Obama seems to be paying to the intelligence leaders, to the intelligence establishment. Whether or not he keeps on these two leaders, I hope, given all the economic problems, given his hopes to do all sorts of things in a kind of a major transforming presidency, which he hopes to have, I hope, I mean this in the literal sense, that he finds the time to focus seriously on this matter of the security of our nation. It's my, he got an intelligence briefing talking about how he'll ever say that he feels that he could or should have paid more attention back then, but it's my view, for what it's worth, that he should have. I hope that President Obama is not so focused on the economic problems and other problems that he neglects to really pay attention to these national security questions, to this threat of Al-Qaeda. Because if a president doesn't make it a priority, it sort of doesn't happen. There were people in the Bush administration who were sort of thinking about the likelihood of attacks by Al-Qaeda in 2001, but at the very highest level, there was not that focus. So I hope that there is that focus in...
Okay, it's your turn. Any questions? And just let me know who you'd like to have answer the question.
I just want to make a quick and brief. I'm Bob Moranto. I'm on leave, but you're a member of the department. We're having a conference all day Saturday at the Connolly Center in the Connolly Theater called Judging Bush. And by the way, you never thanked the man who made Barack Obama's win possible. I think generally presidents are usually 30% in the polls. Usually their parties get pasted in the election. It's kind of what happens. We're going to have a bunch of experts who like Bush and who don't like them. Judging Bush Villanova, and you'll find it all there. And I got a few copies here. Thanks.
Thanks, Bob. Question.
Oh, and Laura Brown's going to speak.
Hi, this is Stephen. Dr. Kerber, you made an interesting statement. You said when a regime starts to lose its intellectual energy, it is reduced to the sum of its affiliated interests. Can you talk a little bit about that as it relates to both parties?
Sure, absolutely. One of the things, the longest election cycle, by the way, we've ever had. And for those of you who love this kind of thing, remember the 2012 cycle has already begun. We already have Bobby Jindal going to Iowa to test the waters for the next time. But when I speak about this to different groups, I would ask, could somebody tell me what conservatism means? Can somebody tell me what does it mean to be a conservative? Because tradition.
Especially for me, we think that they tend to be against what they're for.
Right, some conservatives of a more libertarian stripe would say a kind of laissez-faire attitude towards personal issues. So these are all legitimate ways of answering the question, but none of them is misfortune to win the presidential nomination of his party at a time when he needed to step into that situation. And it was difficult for him as a result of that to ask the country to vote for him for any clear and consistent way. And part of that has to do with the unpopularity of George Bush, but part of the unpopularity of George Bush, a lot of it, has to do with the way he governed. So if you think about it, even to this day, I think you could make the case that John McCain still has not given us a reason to vote for him. He said a lot about Obama. He said a lot about why we shouldn't vote for Obama. But usually a candidate needs to give you a reason to vote for them. And what we're seeing in that is just a very difficult, he had a very difficult time articulating an answer to that question because of where his party is now, rather. You're left then with interest groups that are invested in your party. We saw this when the New Deal coalition was spent of ideas in the 70s and 80s. We saw the same thing, where you have different interest groups that are identified with the Democratic Party. And Republicans used to run against Democrats by saying, oh, well, they're a party of special interests. And it resonated. So the Republicans at this point find themselves in a similar position. One and then two.
I wanted to ask a question about what you thought the liberal media played a role in this election. There are certain things in this election, I mean, that came out about Barack Obama, such as, you know, the Jeremiah Wright scandal, his voting record, and John Edwards calling him out on that. And I mean, things that probably were along the same lines of the Swift Boat veterans with John Kerry that should have destroyed Barack Obama. But yet, I mean, if you look at Time magazine in the month of July, he was on the cover of every issue. And then you had, the New York Times lambasting John McCain every day. So I mean, does this election basically say that if you have $500 million and people think you're cool, I mean, and the media likes you, can you win the presidency?
I think on just in general, if you have a choice between having $500 million and not having $500 million, it's better to have it. So I think there's certainly no question about that. But I guess I would take issue with the way you're characterizing what happened, because you should give Obama some. Obama basically took them head on. And very often he was very good at playing offense from a defensive position. So that's the way he handled Jeremiah Wright. And I think he also got lucky in the sense that he had that long primary campaign with Hillary Clinton, and Hillary basically threw everything she had at him early on, so he was able to get that out early, and that ends up, the terminology we use is it inoculates the public, so that the Bill Ayers story just didn't really resonate towards the end. The one comment I will make about media that I didn't mention before that I think is apropos of what happened this year is the new media. It's actually what I write about. I just didn't have time to talk about it today. But I do think that there was a tremendous difference in the way Obama used the new media, the internet, Facebook, YouTube, and the way the McCain people really never warmed up to it. Interestingly enough, Hillary Clinton never warmed up to it either. But we saw for the first time an internet election that allowed Obama to get his message out in other ways. And I could say a lot more about that, but I want to give you guys an opportunity to ask questions, so I'm not going to. But I think that, if I were asked, well, what was the media's story of this election? I think you'd have to say it was the internet. Yes.
My question is basically about the electorate. It seems like you were talking about the new waves coming in, and there were new waves, and definitely the tide pushing the new waves in was the electorate. It seems like there's a new electorate. You have African Americans, Latinos, young voters, and just new people that were more engaged, and it seemed that the Democratic Party had a better time and more to reach out with to this new electorate than the Republican parties definitely engaged them more. So what do you think that the Republican Party will be able to do in 2012 to re-engage the electorate?
I think that's a great question. I think that's the question. I think that, as my colleagues have said, and I agree with them, we don't quite know yet, because a big piece of the answer to that question rests with how Barack Obama governs. The ball is in his court. And depending on how his administration shapes up, an older and southern base. It's just not big enough. Their base is shrinking, and it's too regionalized geographically. I think that when you look at some of the Latino numbers that we were talking about before, you can't lose Latino voters 2-to-1 and win a national election. If that was the only statistic I had, I could have, if I knew in advance that Latinos were going to vote 2-to-1 for Obama, I would have told you he's winning the election. I don't need to know anything else. So how do you do that? Well, what you don't do is what Governor Pete Wilson did in California, when California used to be a Republican state. California used to be a Republican state. It's hard to believe that, but it was. And, in terms of real time, not that long ago. But Pete Wilson got into a lot of trouble when he was governor, Republican governor of California, had a very hardline immigration stand, and alienated the largest blocks of voters, some of the largest blocks of voters in his state. The National Republican Party has to be very careful not to do the same thing. Yes?
To maintain the Democratic energy, what does Barack have to do in the first 100 days of office?
What does Obama have to do in his first 100 days in office? Well, there's a political cartoon that I'm very fond of, and I think because it sort of encapsulates a lot of what I understand to be the patterns of public opinion. It's a picture of Congress, and you hear on one side of the cartoon is like a little cartoon bubble, the voice of the people, yelling, "Do something!" And then on the other side is another cartoon bubble, the voice of the people saying, "Not that!" So people want change. That's very generic. What change do they want? What will it look like? The process of governing is divisive. It's by definition divisive. I suspect that Obama needs to do a couple of things in general, and then we'll see about the specifics. Number one, he needs to be competent. I think one of the things that Americans are hungering for is a competent president. And he needs to both project competence, which would be a kind of media strategy, but I think it needs to be more than a media strategy. I think he needs to demonstrate that he's in charge of his government, that he's in charge of policy, that he can work with Congress, that there's a sense of moving forward. A lot of the presidency is about atmospherics, and if you've got those atmospherics going for you, people are willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. The other thing I think he needs to do, I do think he probably does need to move quickly, especially as far as the economy and healthcare are concerned, and possibly energy policy. I think if you see a lot of activity early on, it buys him some time, because these are huge issues. He will never have a better political climate than the one he has on the day he takes office. If he wants to do big and bold things, the time to do it is soon and fast. It'll take a long time. The legislative process is not designed to do big things. It's not designed to handle more than one thing at a time. He's got 4 or 5 big top priorities. I say throw it out there. Throw it all out there, and beyond that we have to see where it goes. I don't mind. It's good exercise.
So, my question is for the fourth speaker who dealt with foreign policy. I didn't get your introduction back. So, recently Colin Powell, he made some statements that for me were surprising. My question is, to what extent do you think he'll be involved in the future government? Like, would he be the Secretary of Defense?
I think that, I have a pretty booming voice too, but I guess the microphone doesn't hurt. You know, I think if Colin Powell wanted to be in this administration, I think Obama was harmed. His national reputation was harmed by his service as Secretary of State, and frankly the Iraq War, but still he has quite a very impressive following. And I think he's capable. It's interesting to talk to people about Powell, and you hear sort of different reviews of his level of competence, but I think he's really impressive. I think if he wants to be in this administration, he will be in the administration. But whether he really wants to take that on again at this point, I don't know. I don't know. Secretary of Defense, you said, well, he knows the military. You know, everyone likes, I know that Donald Rumsfeld is not a nice man. But there's some things that I think were defensible about him as Secretary of Defense. You know, he, to bring a kind of a coherence to that department is very hard, because the different branches of the military and then some of the other bureaucracies in the Defense Department, they each kind of want to do things their own way. And Rumsfeld was pretty ruthless, but I think not on all issues, but on some issues he was ruthless in a good way in insisting that department move more toward what's called jointedness, or sort of working together. So I don't know that Powell is mean enough to be as effective as the Secretary of Defense might ought to be.
Any other questions? Do we have any other questions of somebody who hasn't asked it?
I mean, Obama sort of succeeded in mobilizing a large number of voters and sort of created a movement like, I think, what role do you think that sort of grassroots mobilization might play subsequently in his administration? I mean, will we draw on them in order to mobilize support for policies that, you know, maybe of his are more centrist than some of the House Republicans, Democrats would be?
There are indications that Obama intends to use the grassroots online organization that he's built as a vehicle to help him govern. And the possibility here is that we would see something that we political scientists call it going public, where a president tries to go directly to the public, go over the heads of Congress to try to mobilize public support. What would be interesting to look to is whether or not Obama is the first president who uses the internet as well as television to rally public support in this way, in that you could anticipate he would send out text messages and emails right before a big vote saying to his supporters, you know, if you really want universal health care, now's the moment. Email these representatives who are on the fence, something like that. I do think we'll see it. I think he will be the first internet president in that regard. How well it works remains to be seen.
I think this question is trying to address Dr. Brown's presentation on reaction and realignment. you believe that, I guess the jury's still out and we still need to wait, but your citation of the ideological breakdowns between 2000, 2004, and 2008 leads me to wonder if you think that the rejection of McCain's platform, which was essentially deregulate the markets, deregulate essentially everything, reduce government, if people weren't receptive to that idea, or do you think that people were more in line with, well, you do need government, you can't have a failure like Katrina, you can't have poison coming in dog food, you can't have deregulated Wall Street leading to all this?
So thanks. I actually think about three different things on that. One, I think Bush's biggest failure as a president is that he basically moved the Republican Party toward a big government model, and I don't think that his base liked that. I think that's also why they essentially did not turn out in this election. And it's very important to understand that John McCain has a long history with the Republican Party, and Republicans don't really like him. So, you know, some of, I think, what you saw, and I think this is the truth in the turnout numbers, is also that Republicans did not turn out. There was not an interest, obviously, for conservative Republicans to vote, you know, for Senator Obama, and I don't think they really necessarily wanted to vote for Senator McCain. If you look at something like what happened in 1976 between Reagan and Ford, I think you can see how those sort of movements happen. So I think from a Republican side, the Republicans went the wrong direction. I also happen to think that there was actually a Rasmussen poll done, and I believe it was done in September, that looked at President Bush's sort of what the issues were. By and large, the overwhelming majority of the voters were okay with Bush, interestingly enough, on an ideological perspective, but they actually believed he was horrible on a competency perspective. And this is where I completely agree with Dr. Kerbel, that part of the rejection of Bush was simply that, you know, it's been since 1812 that we lost an American city. So with the loss of Katrina, you know, in New Orleans, it's pretty stunning that we could actually have that happen. So I think that there's sort of a multiplicity of things, but I were to say, you know, how do the Republicans find themselves? Well, they probably find themselves in Newt Gingrich's ideology, which was very successful for them for a large number of years, which was actually less government. And certainly that statement, you know, the poll data that shows that more people actually agree with Ronald Reagan on government being a problem. Rasmussen has another poll out that shows that a large plurality, I think it was like 47% of Americans, feel that capitalism is, free market capitalism is absolutely the solution to helping people out of poverty. So I guess what I'm saying is, do I buy the ideological realignment to the left? No. I think if you look over actually almost all of this time, the number of liberals have never substantially increased.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure, quickly.
So if McCain doesn't run as a Republican, which, I mean, you can make the argument that you know, that he makes the argument he's a maverick, he bucks a trend, he's in the middle, yada, 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 right? If he doesn't do that, then he loses a Republican base and maybe picks up independents, which he doesn't do.
Right.
McCain runs as the Republican conservative ideology and is resoundingly rejected. And so if Republicans don't turn out for John McCain, they don't turn out for his message, nobody is turning out for his message. My question is, isn't the ideology that is rejected and not the person, essentially?
I'll talk to the microphone. No, I mean, I don't think so. I think that if you look at how John McCain won, because the Republicans have winner take all, but he always, but he won because of the rules of the game. And then I think what you saw was that an overwhelming number of Republicans didn't turn out for him. I also think that Palin and McCain were really fascinating because I think McCain picked Palin to have her get the conservatives, and he would get to stay in this kind of squishy moderate middle. and he would attract the independents. I think unfortunately they ended up being each other's worst nightmare because he turned off the base and she turned off the independents. So then you had sort of no one. But I'm not so sure. I mean, I also think it's a little ridiculous to think that Palin was actually a huge hindrance at some level. I mean, this is really, I agree with Dr. Moranto, so much of this is about Bush. And this is what, you know, Professor Campbell said, you know, up at SUNY, is that given the structure, given you have a president that has a 30% approval rating, given the fact that the economy is problematic, it's surprising that McCain was even ever in this race at all.
I'm going to add something really quickly. I know we're running out of time. I just, Laura and I often look at this. Also tells you something about how McCain himself saw his position. Because remember, the first rule of vice presidential selection is do no harm. And this was a risky choice. Everybody acknowledges that. Why does John McCain make a risky choice if he's essentially within 1 point or so in the polls? Again, we're going to look at the same data, reach different conclusions. The conclusion I draw, which could be debated, is that because he recognized that it wasn't a situation where he could just choose somebody who was going to be nondescript like Valenti and make it over the goal line. So in any event, I do agree with Laura very much that when the election certainly turned on the meltdown in the financial markets. There's no question about that. You look at it, once that happened, it was over. I think that McCain did a couple of things tactically that made his situation worse than it needed to be. But to be fair to him, I don't know what he could have done, because at that point, you know, voters trust Democrats more on economic matters, just like they tend to trust Republicans more on national security matters. This became an economic election. Bush is in the White House, he's the incumbent, that's the ballgame. And at that point, I really do think the election was over. It was just a matter of by how much. But the fact that McCain saw himself in this position where, Laura's absolutely right, he was the last man standing. That's why he won the nomination. He absolutely won the nomination because of a winner-take-all structure. The Republicans had the same proportional representation of delegates as the Democrats did. You probably would have been left with 4 candidates who each did well with their base, and who knows when this thing would have been resolved, because none of them was able to move beyond their own factional allegiance. The Republican Party did not have a natural leader this year, and they didn't have a clear message. I look at that, and I think Laura and I would agree with that. We reach different conclusions about what that means. But I think we would agree that that was certainly the circumstance that describes 2008. It is now 6 o'clock, so I want to say thank you very much for coming, and thank you to the